Yes,
There we are. There we are. So yeah, now anything you say will be taken down and used in evidence against you. Okay, so we have you recording. Recording is turned on.
I'm used to that.
Yeah, well, I figure maybe we slowly start. We're 6 minutes past the hour, but I think more people will probably join slowly. But today there are three documents, 3 chapters from the Manifesto that is up for discussion, and it's quite a lot of text. It's probably about 20 pages, I think. But in many ways they overlap in content, and so we thought that that we'll do a joint discussion, and then if need be, then we will organize another meeting to follow up. But the three documents are pretty much in sequence about the history of neoliberalism and the way it developed from being an idea until being in total control of politics and economics today over a short period. And then the second document is about the development of modern capitalism since especially after the Second World War. And then the third document is about the lack of ideology on the left that has kind of left the left bewildered and without very much influence over the last 20, 30 years. And so I understand, Pat, you want to talk about all 3 documents more or less at the same time, and then the discussion afterwards, or?
Okay, yeah, probably the best way to do it, I think. Yeah, might be a bit too difficult to take them separately. Might be better to do that. They're all kind of linked together anyway. So. So I know I have a tendency to speak for too long, so I'll try and keep the introduction as brief as possible, right? And especially as we're covering a lot of material. Now, I imagine that only some comrades will have had the time to read all 3 papers, which is okay, because you're going to have time to read them after this meeting before we produce the next set of papers next month. And also comrades will have the time during the summer to read the shorter version, which will be contained in the integrated draft manifesto we're going to have ready for June. I only want to really spend a brief time going through the longest of the 3 draft papers, the one on modern capitalism. Instead, I'd rather mainly focus on the first and last of the draft papers, which are the rise of neoliberalism and the need for a new democratic socialist ideology and program. So the first one on the rise of neoliberalism, just very briefly to take you through the timetable of it, and then highlight what I think are the very important lessons of this this process. So the crisis of capitalist ideology really broke out after the 1930s crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression started in 1929. And this crisis in capitalist ideology arose, and the original capitalist ideology was, of course, that developed at the beginning of the 19th century, was the laissez-faire capitalism, which was where governments were supposed to let capitalism just develop without interference. And they had this attitude because in the feudalist system, everything was highly regulated. Everybody knew their place. You had the lord and the serf, the guilds in the cities, the merchants, and of course things did get upset by wars and all sorts of other things. But normally people were expected to fit within this very rigid hierarchy. And even as production rose and trade rose, The aristocratic, the feudalist system tried to keep control of this, and usually what the king would do is they would allocate a monopoly of a certain trade, so the woolen trade or the iron trade. They would often allocate it as a monopoly to a particular supporter in the aristocracy. And so the capitalists were, in making their revolution against feudalism, they center to their ideology was removing all these restrictions by government, these interferences by government in trade. And so their slogans were things like free trade, free association, etc. And so when capitalism really got going, center and foremost in their ideology was this idea that of laissez-faire capitalism, where the government should not interfere in business, should let business develop. But of course, what happened was the governments did have to intervene to try and curb the most obscene abuses of capitalism, where with child labor and terrible accidents and exploitation and so on. And bit by bit, governments did intervene, but nevertheless, the main core of its ideology continued until the Great Depression. And initially, the governments responded to this with this ideology. So in Britain, in America, and Germany, governments didn't intervene. They allowed the crisis to develop and take its course. But that obviously didn't work, because this was such a huge crisis and such a long-lasting crisis. It led to such massive unemployment and deprivation and poverty in the population that it really shook to the core the ideology of capitalism and discredited it. And as a result, we saw, and at the same time, side by side with this, in the Soviet Union, we had the development of Stalin's 5-year plans, which started from the end of the 1920s, which appeared to all intents and purposes to be a stunning success. That the Soviet Union was being able to super industrialize at an incredible pace, and this had a massive impact on the intellectuals of the West. And it was by government intervention, by planning, by public ownership that this was achieved. Now in America, when Roosevelt came to power, when he was elected in the general election in 1932, I think it was, very quickly he introduced a New Deal, which again was a break with this laissez-faire ideology, because it embraced the idea that government needed to intervene in the economy to create work for the unemployed and many other measures, in spending on infrastructure and so on, in order to generate economic activity. Even the Nazis in this period adopted 4-year plans. They kind of copied the idea of the Soviet Union because they saw it was very popular, and they adopted 4-year plans. Of course, their plans, they did include work on infrastructure. You remember they started to build all these autobahns across the country. But of course, a core part of their 4-year plans was rearmament for war. And then in 1936, we saw the publication of John Maynard Keynes's General Theory. And his approach was that governments needed to intervene in the economy in downturns to spend extra money to boost the economic activity and to try and bring work to the unemployed and to get people buying products and so on, to revive business. And the idea was also that in booms that they would try to minimize those booms, kind of even them out a bit by reducing economic activity, by raising interest rates, etc. So you saw all these developments represented a massive shift away from the the original classical liberal approach to the economy. So in 1936, there were moves in America and Britain, France, and some other places, in Austria and so on, among right-wing economists to overcome this crisis of their ideology. A publishing house was set up in France, which began pumping out books on capitalist ideology, written by these right-wing economists who were to become famous in the later neoliberal movement. People like von Hayek, von Mises, Robinson, and various other famous economists. Then 2 years later, a conference was agreed in 1938 in Paris. And at this conference, it was a gathering together of a range of these figures. They agreed to call their movement neoliberalism, and they also agreed to set up a movement which started to call meetings and so on. But then the Second World War cut across these developments because it made it impossible to meet together and develop the movement. Now, after the war, the neoliberal movement resumed, and they had a conference. They had their first conference in that new wave in Switzerland at a place called Mont Pelerin. And Jonathan's written about this in his draft manifesto versions before. Now, what was interesting about this meeting was that it met at a time when laissez-faire liberal capitalist ideology was in an even bigger crisis. Because what had happened between their first conference in 38 and the one in 47 was all the events had gone against them. First of all, in the war itself, governments had been forced in the West to intervene in the economy and had to direct companies to produce shells and tanks or whatever it might have been. And they'd also intervened in the labor market because they didn't want strikes, so they'd frozen a lot of things. They froze prices in many countries and so on. So this was anathema to these right-wing economists who didn't believe in this kind of intervention in the market. And on top of that, after the war, you saw the emergence of a very strengthened Soviet Union and its expansion across Eastern Europe. So of course that was that was the devil getting even stronger for these right-wing economists. Not only that, in the West, you saw this post-war settlement, which was motivated by a massive radicalization of working people, the threat of revolution was breathing down their neck. And as a result, we saw them. They allowed the introduction of wide-scale nationalization, introduction of public services, the welfare state. The unions got a lot stronger. Social democratic parties got a lot stronger and came to power in many countries. And we saw the introduction of government, employer, trade union, national negotiations about the economy, even elements of public planning, much higher taxes on the companies and the rich. So it was a very, from the right-wing economist point of view, this was a disastrous environment. But nevertheless, they met together. In fact, one of their key participants, he described them meeting at a time of despair for their ideology. But nevertheless, they met together and they decided that they needed to fight back against this. And the analogy I make between this and the position we are in now on the left, there's some, because we're in a very weak position on the left. We're very divided and so on. So there's a lot of parallels here. Now, there's a quote I'd like to give, because when they held this founding conference, which set out to refashion and renew their ideology, the conference was called by Friedrich Hayek, who became effectively the father of the neoliberal movement. And he laid out their counter-revolutionary strategy 2 years later after the founding of this first conference. And I'd like to quote this because because it's in the document. I think it's very significant. And he says, and I'm going to change a couple of the words here just to mix things up. He says, we must be able to offer a new socialist program which appeals to the imagination. We must make the building of a collective society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage. What we lack is a socialist utopia which does not confine itself to what appears today as politically possible. We need intellectual leaders who are willing to work for an ideal, however small may be the prospects of its early realization. They must be men and women who are willing to stick to principles and to fight for their realization, however remote. So in that quotation, what I've done is I've substituted where he said liberal, I've substituted socialist. But the reason I've done that is because this could have been a statement by a revolutionary leader on the left. but it's a counter-revolutionary leader on the right, and he's putting forward why we need to redevelop a liberal program, a liberal utopia, and very significantly he says that although the prospects of its early realization are not strong, we need to be willing to work for it, and we need to stick to our principles and fight for their realization, however remote. And I think that approach is exactly, in a way, what we need to do today. Now, the other thing is that the new neoliberal movement didn't set out with a short-term perspective. They weren't expecting fast gains. They knew it would take at least a generation to develop into a serious intellectual and political force. And what's also interesting is they didn't just think in terms of developing a new ideology with some theoretical documents and some slogans and so on. They actually realized that they need to apply this ideology in a very practical way to the world. And the core of this ideology was a bit different from the classical laissez-faire ideology. They did accept that there was some need for government intervention in the market. But their idea was that it was just to regulate the market and to ensure healthy competition. And they set out that all other economic intervention, the public ownership, public services, the welfare state, and all the rest of it, that it needed to be rolled back, which at that time seemed to be an incredible mountain to climb, but that was what they set themselves. And what they did was they set about doing this principally through writing papers and books, organizing conferences, and setting up think tanks. And what was very important to them was that the idea of carrying out systematic work on how to put their ideology into practice, a whole set of practical policies which would allow them to implement their ideas in society. And that is why, the neoliberal movement, when we see it in practice, even to the present day, they have a whole kind of playbook of measures to introduce when they manage to get into power. So they will lift restrictions on currency exchange. They will, privatize in all sorts of ways, different things. They will make all kind of cuts. They will set the central bank free of government intervention. So, for example, even now, only a few weeks ago, they in Brazil, where I'm living, they stopped the government control of the central bank and made it effectively. What they then do is they put it under the control of the financial sector, the capitalist financial sector, and the neoliberals themselves. So this was their attitude. Now, in practice, they did start off with a lot of ideological principles, but in practice, as time went on, they started to come under the control of their sponsors, the people who put their money behind them, which was big corporations, the rich, and even under government control, because they got the secret support of various governments, including particularly the CIA. And so actually their ideology started to become very distorted in the favor of big business. So originally they argued in favor of small businesses, the healthy competition and so on. And they argued against monopoly, but very quickly all these ideas kind of got blurred. And then in fact, the Americans in particular under Milton Friedman took over the movement and imposed ideas about, well, we should have a benign stance to monopoly. And in practice, the neoliberals have gutted the laws against monopoly and trusts. Either they've got rid of the laws, or they just made them, they've made it sure that they're not implemented. The same with dictatorship. When the neoliberals began, it was all about freedom, against fascism, against communism, against dictatorship, which they said interfered with the market and the true development of the economy. But in practice, they very quickly started to turn a blind eye to dictatorships, and we saw when they really started to have an influence in Chile, for example. The economic policy that was adopted after Pinochet's coup against the left was actually devised by the Chicago economic adherents of neoliberalism together with the CIA, the economic program that they developed, I think it was called El Ladrillo, was devised by them for a dictatorship. And not just an ordinary dictatorship, one that was actually viciously imprisoning and torturing and murdering people. So, you know, and they were going down there, the neoliberals were traveling down to Santiago regularly. So much for their original principles. Then, of course, the big economic crisis in the world that broke out in 1971 to 73 in the capitalist world was the moment when Keynesianism became discredited through the explosion of inflation, and the neoliberals were able to increasingly take over. We saw the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1975, who was a fanatical neoliberal and follower of this movement. And then we saw Reagan, she then came to power in 1979, Reagan came to power the following year. And I think we're all pretty familiar with how neoliberalism has spread like an octopus all over the capitalist world, over academia, over media, over economics, and over government, to the point where they dominate almost every aspect of it. And now you might have thought that when the crisis came in 2008, 2009, the great economic recession, which was quite clearly a neoliberal, crisis of neoliberal policies that have been implemented and failed, you would have thought that that would have been, a moment for the left to grow and for neoliberalism to be discredited. But they were able to turn that crisis to their advantage and actually intensify the cuts in public spending, the privatization, and so on. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about modern capitalism because it's quite a big subject. I think comrades are more than maybe they wouldn't have had time to read the document and so on. But the first thing I just want to say about that is that modern capitalism, as we say there, is effectively is neoliberal version of capitalism, because most people living today in the world were actually born since these developments I've been talking about of the coming to power of neoliberalism in the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. And they don't actually know any other form of capitalism. So we, the older generation, we used to talk about that post-war settlement I was talking about, after the Second World War, when there was a relatively golden age of capitalism, when capitalism grew very fast in the West, but there was this kind of agreement between the employers, labor, and governments to negotiate and tolerate each other and so on. And they did accept that they needed to have a welfare state and so on. But that's the era we were brought up in and what we would think about. But that's not the era the younger generations have grown up in. So they don't know any other form of capitalism, ironically. And neoliberalism, as it's become dominant in capitalism, it's greatly unleashed the negative tendencies and contradictions of capitalism. I think I used the description, I called it capitalism on steroids. And all these negative tendencies and contradictions of capitalism, we can't list them all, there's just too many, but we go through some of the main ones about how we've seen the growth of insecurity and poverty at work, which in itself, all of these things actually damage capitalist long-term interests, ironically, but nevertheless, that's what happened. Then we saw the privatization of so many industries and the deregulation of so many things, which have again had negative consequences for capitalism, which we go into in the document. We've seen the financialization of the economy, where the financial sector, the banks and so on, have become more and more powerful in the economy, and how this has actually damaged the manufacturing sector and so on, and the development of rent seeking, where people, where the rich and corporates are making their money not through genuine development of industry, of new products and so on, but just through capturing control of certain aspects of the economy and charging rents on them effectively, or fees or whatever, and making their money from that. And of course, it's much easier to do that than actually take risks and invest money in new productive forms. We've seen all the cuts in the public services and welfare services that have damaged working class people and have actually, funnily enough, have actually reduced, along with deregulation, they have reduced a lot of the what were sensible laws and regulations that were, controlling capitalism, and thus we see all kinds of negative outcomes from this. We've seen the development of monopolization, and of course, monopolization. The end result of it is that, and we now have a situation in most sectors of the economy where over 90% of the economy is dominated by 4 companies, that sector. And often it's 2 companies dominate more than the majority of the company of that sector. And the end result of that, of course, is you get all kind of distortions of the economy. You get all sorts of bad practices. And there's a tendency to reduce the incentives for investment and research and development and so on. And not only that, we then go on to talk about how these big companies, these huge monopolies, have become too big to fail. So in many cases, the government has to intervene and prop them up and subsidize them in many ways. And so you end up with this weird situation of what the expression of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, or for the rest. And then we see the whole development of inequality. So capitalism, left to its own devices, inevitably produces more and more inequality, because the lion's share of the profits go to the rich and to the managers of the companies, and then it's a built-in process of more and more inequality, and we see that incredible degree. In fact, the rich now, we point this out, as there's never been in the history of humanity where we've got such levels of wealth accumulated in so few hands, where we've got a billionaire class develop in the planet, which, just a few people are dominant. Sorry, hello. So if one of the comrades could mute their.
I'm just trying to figure out here.
Yeah, it's no. Hopefully they hear that. No problem. So this rise of inequality, this billionaire class, is just a few people now have more wealth than a whole host of countries, and we see, the Oxfam comes out with these reports every year, which I'm sure the comrades are familiar with, especially if they read, if they follow Michael Roberts' excellent Marxist economic blog, and they will see these figures regularly commented on by him and analysed. We talk about the rise of the managers. I won't go into that. We also talk about, the chaos of the market versus what could be achieved through planning. And, we talk about the explosion of corruption. And all of these things are distorting the capitalist system, and they're giving the big companies and the most wealthy billionaires, it's allowing them to take over the what was a limited form of democracy that had been fought for by the labor movement in the 19th century into the 20th century. Is more and more being taken over and being manipulated by these incredibly powerful economic forces, along with the media and so on. And the results of all this is a growing crisis of investment, which I don't have time to go into here, but any comrades might like to comment on if they like. It's led to a capitalist form of globalization, which is effectively meaning that all the countries and cities are competing with each other to offer lower wages, less controls on the environment, less controls on health and safety, and all sorts of other aspects. So we end up in a race to the bottom in the world, which is to the detriment of working people. And coming near to the end, really, last but not least, we're seeing the exploitation of nature reach an incredible degree, and the threat of climate change. And we cover all these points. And we finish off in capitalism. We raise some limited perspectives about the future of capitalism, and in those we address the question of whether it's possible to go back to the era before neoliberalism. Now, this is we deal with this question because there's all these kind of mainstream more and more mainstream economists and liberal economists who are dreaming of going back in their books. They're coming out with books all the time criticizing neoliberal capitalism. and dreaming of going back to the era, the golden era of the 1950s and 60s in the post-war settlement. And we conclude that this is highly unlikely that it would be possible to do that. Why? Because the post-war settlement only really came about because of the peculiar and dramatic circumstances of a world war against the fascists and its outcome in favor of working people. And these are circumstances that they're very unlikely to be repeated. In fact, we show that neoliberalism is not an exceptional form of capitalism, which is what these liberal economists try to portray. In fact, neoliberalism is in many ways the normal capitalism. It's returning us to the time before the Second World War. And through its aggressive reassertion of capitalist ideology in practice, neoliberalism is really only revealing capitalism's true nature. So that neoliberalism is not the exception, it's the actual normal capitalism. Now, the other point we finish off with is that you would think, as I said earlier, that crises would halt the could halt the neoliberal juggernaut, and that could happen. But we have noticed that the neoliberals have shown a keen grasp of how to manipulate crises in their favor. It's a task in which they're ably assisted by their control, of course, of the capitalist mainstream media and now much of the social media. And in many ways, neoliberals have adopted the motto, don't let a good crisis go to waste. They've come to understand that in a crisis, they're often able to make their most daring advances. You know, it's when people's attention are most distracted and confused that the dramatic conditions appear to justify dramatic changes. So that's how we dealt with the question of modern capitalism. And obviously comrades might want to go into that in more detail. The last paper is perhaps the most interesting one, which is on the need for a new democratic socialist ideology and program. And the first two papers, in a way, laid the basis for us to look at that. And I think I'm hoping that that will be probably the paper that most comrades will want to comment on, because it has the most immediate impact on both how we look at the left and socialist ideology, and in a way lays the basis for the next section of the manifesto on what that democratic socialist ideology and program should be. Now, what we lay out there, and this is something that funny enough, we ourselves didn't really appreciate fully, and it's very interesting to see Jonathan comments on this in his latest, his commentary on Themis's document, but he also talks about this question about that the key problem of the left is the fact that it doesn't anymore have an ideology and a program. And I think he's right on that. And we came to this conclusion through the research we were doing. And in many ways, we were quite surprised when we learned about how the neoliberals approached their crisis of ideology in the 1930s and 40s. And we could see a lot of parallels and lessons that to be drawn from that and the success that they had perhaps offers hope to us on the left, because I think what I think we have to start with is to recognize that we are in a big crisis ideologically on the left, and that this crisis came to a head in the 1990s when the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc, when it collapsed, and when at the same time, and not coincidentally, the kind of socialist elements of social democracy fell away, and both of these had been the target of the neoliberals. They had been making a criticism which parallels in some ways the criticism we used to make of these institutions and these examples of semi-socialist ideologies and practice, which was that the big problem with them was that they were run from the top in a very top-down bureaucratic mode, and that as a result all kind of problems came of inefficiency and lack of human rights and lack of democracy and so on. And it wasn't just a problem in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, it was also in the Western countries, because we had our own examples of public ownership, public services, state expansion, even elements of planning and so on. And we had suffered from, maybe not in such a dramatic way as the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where these things were dominated the whole economy and the whole society. But nevertheless, we had a similar problem in the West, in that all the institutions that the labor movement fought for and achieved suffered from a top-down and bureaucratic and elements of inefficiency and so on. Now, I'm not going along with all of the criticisms of the neoliberals, because often they were over-exaggerated. And as we have seen, the replacement of these things by neoliberal programs have been far worse. So far from getting rid of bureaucracy and inefficiency, it often made it much worse. And nevertheless, not speaking about all the dramatic effect this has had on working class people's living standards and public services and so on. So, but nevertheless, I think that when the ideology of you know, kind of socialist experiments, if you could put it that way, of the Soviet bloc and the social democracy in the other side in the West, when these failed and were seen to have failed and collapsed in the 1990s, you remember that was the period when that guy Fukuyama came out with his the end of ideology. You remember what was actually shown to be daft, but the end of history, he called it, the end of ideology, the end of history is the name of his pamphlet. That was the ruling classes of the world and the capitalists of the world thought that their time in the sun had come, that their enemies had all been vanquished. Now was the New World Order. Do you remember they called it New World Order? And since that time, I mean, if you compare us to the neoliberals, they recognized the failure of the crisis of their ideology. So they realized the need to get together, to have conferences, to write books about it and so on. But if you compare that with the left, we didn't do that. There was very few worthwhile books published on this subject. I've searched them, I've found a few, but not only partially useful books. And we certainly didn't organize conferences on the left to discuss the implications of all this. You know, what had caused the failure of this, these systems and these applications? And what could we draw from that in creating a new version of socialism that could appeal to the mass of the population? And what I mentioned the mass of the population because, of course, we coming from the Trotskyist movement mainly, and there were other elements like the anarchists and so on who had these deep criticisms of the Soviet Union and social democracy. We thought that when these systems collapsed, it would be good for us because we thought it was clearing the decks and our ideas would come to the fore, but it didn't happen that way. In fact, among the mass of the world's population, it was socialism as a whole was seen as discredited, and a big question mark over socialism came to the fore. And as a result, capitalism under its new neoliberal guise appeared to most people to be the only alternative. And of course, as time's gone on, more and more people have become discredited with capitalism and its neoliberal version, but they don't see any credible alternative. And that's the big crisis that the left faces. And as a result, the left has got weaker. It's got less effective in society, less credible. It's become more divided and infighting has developed. And what tends to happen is that every new issue that comes along throws another spanner in the works for the left. And our fundamental underlying problem is that nowadays, we don't really have an ideology. And that undermines our confidence as a whole. You know, that's why a socialist alternative, you know, a democratic socialist alternative doesn't come to the fore in debates, doesn't get posed as an alternative to capitalism. Very much you'll find that most of the left people, whether they're in the mass left parties to the left of social democracy, or they're in social democracy, or whatever, they will tend to put forward ideas that could take us back only to the 70s, not even to the 60s, ironically. We ended up with a very timid program. And now the revolutionary left themselves, they would still argue, obviously, for a revolution, for a replacement capitalism. But their program, they've kind of tried to carry on business as usual. They maybe added a few phrases into there, what we stand for, but that seemed to be the limit. I remember Khalid was telling me about how the CWI had a conference. There was the World Social Conference, you know, that set up in contrast to the World Economic Conference. And they were having meetings, big meetings all around the world. And they had one in Pakistan. And he was telling me about how the CWI had a meeting on the fringes of it, very well attended meeting. And the title of the meeting was for a socialism of the 21st century, or for 21st century socialism, which has become quite a fashionable phrase. But when they did their speeches, and then they came to some questions from the audience, one speaker from the audience after another said, well, you know, you've got us here of false pretenses. Where's the 21st element in where's there anything new in what you're putting forward? You're just putting forward the version of socialism we were put forward in the 20th century. And I think that just sums up the problem ideologically. So, you know, we go through some talking about what was at the heart of the problem of the failure of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. What was at the heart of the failure of the socialist elements that did exist in social democracy. And we talk about how quite clearly we need to come forward with a very different approach to democratically running all the public sector and all the socialist forms that we would put forward. And that's why we talk about a new democratic socialist ideology. And what that will mean in practice is obviously what we're going to go to in the next section of the manifesto. And we can have lots of debate about that and discussion and try to work out a consensus on that, hopefully. So I conclude here is that we try not to be pessimistic here, because we believe that it is possible to overcome these problems. And it's only if we do so that we'll be able to turn what is a crisis for the left now into actually an opportunity. So I'll finish on that point. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of different issues, but somehow coherent in some ways, and I guess they're difficult to separate in the discussion. So maybe we'll just carry on trying to narrow down the focus on some of the issues that Pat mentioned. Is anybody burning to respond? Jonathan, you have to unmute yourself. I think you were muted when the plumber came. Or there.
That's all right. You can hear me.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's very good that Pat and Khalid are laying down, it seems, quite a lot of work and proper research in developing these documents, and I think they are taking the discussion forward. I have a few points which I want to raise. I have read the documents, the three latest ones published. And the first is a very minor point, and this is what you talk about when you talk about socialist ideology. I would prefer to avoid that terminology. Marx actually defined ideology as false consciousness, and as such, it was kind of reserved for bourgeois ideologies. So I think it's better to maybe talk about a socialist alternative or something like that. The second point I want to make is it's very much on the question of neoliberalism, and you've gone into quite a lot of detail, and there's things of quite a few things come up there which are new to me. But I do think you miss one aspect of neoliberalism, which I think is quite important. And that is they did talk about privatization. They did privatize a lot. But as a percentage of GDP in most countries, the public expenditure remained about the same. It dipped in some countries for a period of time. and then it rose again. But from the beginning of the period to the end of the period, in most countries, it was more or less the same from the beginning of 1980s until a few years ago. Although it varies a bit from country to country, but on average, I would say that. And I think that what that reflects is an important phenomenon in neoliberalism, which is what was done with the money. Because clearly, I mean, there have been cuts in welfare across the board, and quite substantial ones. I think what happened is what has been termed in some academic circles as the development of a hidden developmental state. And that is that larger and larger sums of money are being transferred to companies. While companies cut down on research and development, the state steps in, and we see that with the vaccine now, for example, huge amounts of money which the state has put into developing vaccines. And then the companies just can profit from the research which various parts of the state have created. And the importance of this, I think, is that the taxation has become a kind of transmission mechanism of taking from the working class and transferring it to companies via the state. And I think that explains why the percentage of GDP passing through the public sector has not actually declined on average in most countries during this period. But it's significant not only in that fact in by itself, but of course, this I think opens up for what we're having in the present time, a very dangerous development, because if the capitalists are going to be fed more and more by the state, it becomes more and more of interest of the capitalists to control parts of the state apparatus in order to get their share of the money which is being transmitted from the working class to companies. And the competition between companies to control parts of the state apparatus intensifies, and there is a greater tendency for the state apparatus to be torn apart by these conflicts, because there's more at stake now with controlling the state apparatus, why capitalists in greater and greater amount step into actual government. You have more and more billionaires appearing in government, more and more active capitalists appearing in government than really at any time before in history, as they try and get control of workers' taxes. Which brings me to the third point, which I want to make, which is, I think, is in a way this thing about neoliberalism, I think is a thing of the past. I think, for example, the question of state intervention in the economy is definitely in the rise, and it doesn't really matter what wing of the capitalist class that's concerned. Biden is now trying to put together a $3 trillion infrastructure package in the United States. And this is immediately after the $1.9 trillion this latest package which they do. So I think the state, regardless, is stepping into the economy more and more, and that is a tendency which is going to deepen. But again, it's part of the conflict between different sections of the capitalist class. So they're trying to get the state to intervene on their particular behalves. I mean, for example, now it's something which has been raised by the nationalist right-wing section of the capitalist class, is they want to get control over the internet giants, for example, and most likely that's going to happen in one form or another in the coming years. is that there going to be a huge state intervention into how the internet companies are being run. And even Biden now is talking about, which already Trump had been talking about, controlling prices for medicines, and all kinds of interventions are growing into the economy, but in a very sick manner due to this basic conflict within the capitalist class. So I think really, in my mind, the fundamental character of the neoliberalism died in 2008 with the financial crisis then. And since then, we've seen, on the one hand, the development of what has been called right-wing populism, nationalism, or whatever, and a conflict with liberal capitalism. But liberal capitalism is not the same as it was before 2008. As you can see with Biden's, I mean, he's talking about $5 trillion, which will, the debt the United States has already been taken. Sorry, let me just let the dog out. Okay, so I mean, the national debt of the United States is already close to the level of the Second World War in percentage of GDP, which is a massive, massive debt. And now they're talking about raising it much, 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 much higher. So while this conflict goes on within different sections of the capitalist class, like in any epoch, you know, they will tend to also borrow from each other's policies, and the so-called liberal, neoliberal section of the capitalist class is borrowing economic policies from the right. It was Trump who first talked about this huge infrastructure plan also, and the right, on the other hand, is borrowing also political concepts like identity politics, which they've recast as nationalist identity politics from the neoliberals. So we're in this epoch, I think, of continued rise of the nationalist right-wing section of the capitalist class, continued rise of conflict with the others, but where also they borrow from each other's policies. So the kind of neoliberalism which you described, I think is from the past, and no longer what really is the main thing today. The final thing I want to take up is on the question of the socialist alternative. I don't really see that. I mean, yes, the socialist alternative in the past, there was a problem with democracy. It was a problem, certainly a problem in the Stalinist countries. We know from our own experience there was a problem with democracy within the social democratic parties too, although it was less than in the Stalinist parties. And there was certainly a problem with that in the revolutionary left too. But I think the key factor is really the collapse of the Soviet Union as an alternative economic system. I think that's, oh, damn. Now it's the plumber at the door. Anyway, I think that's the key thing. I have to go. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I've talked enough anyway. Okay,
Thanks,
I'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah, that raises some interesting points too about the latest development in neoliberalist politics. In a way, the failures of them to bring about what were the objectives of, or their proclaimed objectives in their original statements or ideology, but Has anybody got some remarks on Jonathan's or other topics? Timos?
Yes, first of all, we are in front of a really massive amount of work, and there is a fair description of the items that are contained in the three documents. Of course, we've only got these documents 2 weeks back, and that's much too short a space to have a definite
True. Yeah.
a definite position. So whatever I'm saying it in, as first impressions from reading these papers. There are a number of issues that I would like to raise, and I think we should be a bit more careful when we explain these phenomena that are described. First of all, I want to agree with the minor point of Jonathan about the socialist the new ideology on two counts. Saying that we need a new socialist, democratic socialist ideology makes two things. One is the one Jonathan mentioned, that ideology is not necessarily a good idea to have as something set in stone or something that we are going to impose on reality in the sense that Marx puts it. The second one, which probably is more relevant, is that it suggests that we don't have an ideology, that we don't have something to stand on, that we have to reject everything in the past and start from the start. I know this is not the Pat's intention, but this is what it gives out. The other thing that I would like to mention is my skepticism about the whole analysis of the neoliberal project. The way it is approached in these documents is it is as if a small group of people sat down together, they put down some goals, they pursued them effectively and with insistence and with persistence, and they managed to make their ideas dominant and structure society around them. This is an idealist approach. It's an approach that puts priority to the ideas, and then these ideas are imposed on reality. This is the basic thing that Marx said, that we should come and we should see the things the other way around. It's reality that forms consciousness, not consciousness that forms reality. And if we follow what happened, we shall see that all these ideas that were hammered out by these right-wing economists, when they started coming into implementation phase, let's say, they just disappeared, they changed, they were distorted. So what is happening here? We had a development in the economic system. We have a development in capitalism that took various phases. And when the post-war capitalist arrangements were crumbling, the liberals came to the rescue. But it wasn't Hayek's neoliberalism. It was a very eclectic neoliberal mix, which fitted their ideas of the moment. So the new situation created conditions which neoliberalism, as we know it until 2008, managed to rescue capitalism from its problems for a period until it exhausted itself as well, and we had the collapse of 2008. So I would see rather the inner processes, the inner dynamics of capitalism changing, and because of what was going on, and in these changes changed the ideological narrative that covered these changes and served their interests. So this is one thing. The second thing that the other thing that we should see is that from 2008 onwards, we have a very strange situation. We have a very transitional period. I mean, they are trying to put things together, to run things, so the things are changing rapidly, and they didn't get out of their crisis. They didn't manage to reverse the collapse of the system in 2008, and this came up to last year when coronavirus struck. Now, coronavirus is not the reason for the crisis. It's just exacerbating what is going on there to a massive extent. And if I may make an analogy, the crisis of 1929 was followed by the Great Recession, and that ended in World War II. And World War II was a massive destruction for the system, for the economy, at such a massive scale that after the war they had to implement some measures to make the system survive, and that was quite successful. And we had an uninterrupted growth period until the 70s, and it's only after the 70s that this period exhausted itself and the neoliberalism started coming in. I can see an analogy here. 2008 did not resolve the crisis was not resolved until now, and coronavirus is probably playing the role of World War II now, and it's changing things. It's giving the opportunity to manipulate, to have some sort of social engineering. And it's interesting that Jonathan proposes that it's a conflict between different parts of the capitalist class, and I think he's right here. What I disagree on that is that it's not just any two different kinds of capitalist class that we are talking about there. It's a capitalist class as we knew it, which is the smaller capitalists and the competitive sector and competition and anti-monopoly legislation. This is the one part of the capitalism. These are being under threat from the big monopolies, which are taking over slowly but surely. And they are controlling the political system, they are controlling society, they are controlling the economy, they are even putting down the rules of how each one of them can cheat each other. And this is the big conflict today in the capitalist class, between the monopolies, between the big players, the big banks, the financiers, and the vast majority of capitalists who are losing control, who are losing the capability to control the state, and the state is passing from these people to the next. And I would suggest, although that there needs a lot of discussion and a lot of research to be documented, that the right-wing populists, as they are called, they are partly basing themselves on these threatened capitalists, these people who are losing out, and these people who they are trying to go back to some glorious day of capitalist competition, of national pride, and they put all this in. And this is also relevant as far as the working class is concerned. And we should not be surprised that the working class, huge chunks of the working class, fall for these dreams for the past, and they vote for people like Trump, or they vote for Brexit. These are processes that have to be analyzed, and we have to see that. So also I consider that we should see that things are changing. We cannot go back to laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century or the early 20th century, as has been discussed, any more than we can go back to the post-war period. We are going forward. Capitalism is changing, and we are seeing again capitalism with new phenomena, new parameters that are important and crucial in changing things. The third thing that I am a bit worried about is that looking at to the neoliberals as a model for our organization is completely misplaced. Even the passage that Pat read today shows this problem. In fact, what is proposed there is that we see our work as a slow, straight line work from today until the next generation, when we shall convince people slowly and in a linear way to come to us, and together we do something. This is not the way things go. Things move. Things change in a very unpredictable fashion. Today it may be calm. Tomorrow it can be a huge explosion, and we have seen such explosions come out. And the left failed to take advantage of them, and we should learn from them. We should not say, "Oh, they failed, so throw them away." Syriza's example is crucial. I think it has to be discussed and understand where it went wrong, why it went wrong, what was missing, and what should be our case next time around when we see similar phenomena. Corpin's experience is very important. We had a chance there, an unbelievable chance. We cannot say we blew it, we just leave it around and change course. In fact, seeing it in retrospect, we should be very careful there, because when Corpin lost in the last election, I, along with many other people, we said, okay, the Corpin experiment is over. The Labour Party is lost. Let's see what we can do further down the road. But it's only a very short period, and the new leadership of the Labour Party is failing. So either the Labour Party is going to go down and disappear, or a resurgence of militancy could crop up. I don't know. This is the sort of things that we should be discussing, and we should be trying to find out what's going on. The fourth thing I want to mention is that trying to organize ourselves and draw out a program, draw out a democratic socialist society, how it will look like. It looks to me a bit voluntarist. It looks to me that we decide that we do that and we shall do it. We don't connect it with the people. We cannot really go there and tell people, this is what we are proposing, come with us. We should build this program together with the working class, together with the people. And that's where we should find ways to connect ourselves with fighting for socialism. That was what was done in the Syriza days, that was what was done in the Corbyn days, and that's what we should try to do better next time.
Thank you. Themis, I see a yellow hand there, Roy. Let me just, oops. Okay, now we can hear you.
Thank you. You're calling me in, Tim, yeah? I think what Themis says is, I don't disagree what Themis says, but I think he's sort of talking slightly differently to what the subject matter is at the moment. He's talking about interventions in the movement and then what we do and perspectives. That's an entirely irrelevant discussion. But I don't see a problem personally with the name of ideology, but I do agree, and listening, and since we first thought about this question of the loss of ideology, I've looked back at various speakers who have come to that conclusion in their minds, but haven't said it in those explicit terms. I think we have to go back to explaining or examining what is democracy or what is socialism. And it's interesting that these Western powers that claim to be democratic, in inverted commas, are the most undemocratic organisations you could wish to come up to. I was listening to a speech by Noam Chomsky from quite a few years ago on YouTube, and he was talking about force and the role of force of capitalism, and he starts off talking about the United States at the beginning of the Second World War, who starting to plan their takeover of the world economy. And I think this is another illustration of group people getting together. This is not about Marx saying material strands create your consciousness. This is a specific strategy that the US did. They sat there not at the end of the war, but at the beginning of the Second World War, and carved and planned each area of the world that they were going to take over, including the old British Empire. And he talks about the role of force and what they've over the period of time in some detail. And you've got all these things of how they fix the terms of trade, how they use economic sanctions, military interventions, puppet dictators, covert operations for the CIA. We know all that goes on. And there is this, I suppose, the most democratic, what a great democracy we all are. And this is what the reality is that people don't know about. And this is what we've got to help try and make public. And we need and in terms of the analysing events, I think, of course, we have to analyse events of what went wrong, because, and I think Pat points out some of the mistakes, in his view, that was made in the Russian Revolution, and we've just had the anniversary of the Paris Commune, which I honestly didn't know a great deal about. But one of the things that seems to have come out of that, they didn't take over the bank. So there's loads of lessons that if we're going to write a manifesto, we've got to look at history and look at what mistakes was made, and that's what's the importance of some of the backup documents that Pat and Khaled have been writing. So and I think that I posted that talk on the Facebook group, the public Facebook group, if anyone wants to listen to it. It's very interesting. And it also demonstrates a few other things. Is what's come out in the document is the role of the nation state still. You know, all this, and it's been mentioned already. You know, these sort of leaning on each other now, the nation state and the big business, big finance capital that are running the show more now within governments. And the nation state still playing a big role, which is important for us to understand, and the power of the elite groups that are running that. So there's loads of things that we need to bring out, but I think most of all, we can't carry on talking about socialism as it's something in the future that we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how people are going to, it's going to be run, what it is. I mean, so I think it's important that when we move on to the next stage of this debate, that we do have something, whether you call it an ideology or a socialist alternative, a much better document and a much better understanding, so that we can explain to people what we mean by socialism, because it's been corrupted so many times. And as comrades have said, there's so much division on the left now. There's 25 different groups in the British Labour Party. That's not including the groups outside the Labour Party, like Socialist Workers' Party and so the Socialists and all them other hundreds of people that are out there. There's so many divisions that there's nothing that binds people together. And I think that if we're going to go to working people, we've got to have a much better, much more laid out, much more prescriptive idea of what socialism means, to explain and build a movement. And I think we can do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy. Jonas, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be short, but we had a small meeting in Sweden this Monday, and we discussed documents and so on. And I do think that one of the issues. Sorry, just give me a second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
fine.
Perfect. I mean, I think we are in general agreement on the whole sort of development of the history of capitalism and the role of the Soviet Union and so on. And I think we produced some, very good documents on this, and I think we are in agreement in very much about this. I think it's excellent that we could lay those documents to rest and focus on what's happened in recent years and also in the next coming year. And I do think it's important that we reproduce some of the excellent texts that have been written about the recent experiences. Tenos mentioned the collapse of Syriza in Greece, and I remember when it was very when we actually lived through the experience of Syriza the first 5 or 6 months, we did produce very concrete documents on what such a government would be doing in order to alleviate the acute crisis. So what I feel that we do manage to produce these type of documents in the moment, because even if in Greece and what happened if the Labour Party failed and so on, in the next coming years we are seeing left reformist parties coming to power or something within the reach of power in several countries. So these types of issues will be repeating over the next couple of years, perhaps not in the major countries, but in small and mid-sized countries. And I think what's important is that we gather together these lessons in some sort of document that's very shareable. And I think over the next period, we must focus on those issues. Because I do agree that the main issue is that we do not have a coherent message that can be easily explained and gathering around. I think this mainly is looking into the Western world, because if you're looking at the developing world, you do have China as an example, and you're just getting basic infrastructure running in lots of the developing world thanks to Chinese investment. It's an enormous positive development for the level they are. We in the developed world doesn't see this in the same way, and that means we do not have this sort of positive influence. And I think that's the main thing. So I think we should feel that we are finished with the documents discussing the development of capitalism and the fall of Soviet Union, because we are in essential in agreement about those things, and then a focus on what would the short to mid-term solutions be. Thank you.
Did you want to say something, Pat, or?
Yeah, well, if I can come back, well, I can come back at the end or now, whichever is better. If other comrades want to come in, I'm happy to wait. Any other comrades want to say? Well, all right, I can come back on some of these points, yeah? Maybe that will stimulate the discussion, yeah? Jonathan's, let me see if I can find where my notes were, what the comrade said. Okay, yeah. Jonathan mentioned this thing about ideology, a quote by Marx where he defined ideology as false consciousness. Well, actually, this was a one-off statement by Marx, which I don't think he repeated anywhere else. And everyone in the socialist movement has ignored since. So the whole socialist communist movement has used the term ideology again and again over millions of times since then. I think, maybe he's right. Socialist alternative is a better way of putting it. But I think ideology is an accepted term in society by most people. And I think one of the important things we should do is we should use terminology that people understand and is used, and not try to come up with, reject terminology or come up with terminology that, is weird. I mean, the fact that Marx mentioned this one time, I've heard this, said by people, but I don't think even then, even reading what he said about it, it's quite complicated what he says about that, actually. But ideology is a term that's used all over the place by all kinds of people for all kinds of things. So I don't think we should just throw the word out because Marx happened to say it one time. We're not a religious organization. But I take on board that, and we do talk about, I think we prefer to talk about a democratic socialist alternative than get into the words of ideology all the time. But I think that's how people, we have to relate to how people see things and not just impose our meanings on things. That's how I see it. Now, on the point that Jonathan made about public spending, very important points he made there, isn't it? About how first of all, about public spending, but I don't think that undermines neoliberalism, because what they've done is they've changed the nature of public spending from public to private. That's what they've done. So although it's spent by the government, spent on private purposes, which he gives very good examples of, about how money is being transferred from state entities to private companies and to the wealthy, and the way that tax is being transferred from the majority of people, you know, working class people, middle class people, to the rich. And that's what the neoliberals wanted to do. They wanted to privatize all the elements of the state. So that falls within their ideology. It doesn't go against their ideology. And I think what Jonathan says about the drive for the control of state activities has intensified. And this damaging competition between the billionaires over state resources, I think, is a very important point. We do make that point in the contradicts, but I think we could beef that up, because it is undermining. It's we point out how this kind of this rent-seeking mentality is undermining the ethos of capitalist investment, risk-taking, and so on. And I think we could maybe beef that up, and I think it's a good point he's making there. And of course, how you know, that's going to become probably an even bigger and bigger issue. On the question about neoliberalism on the decline, growing state intervention, obviously there are contradictory trends going on within capitalism. Not everything goes in one direction. But again, this growing state intervention is always nowadays orientated towards, or almost always towards, the private sector. So for example, they tried, you know, even during the coronavirus crisis, while they were clapping the NHS workers, they were busily giving all the contracts for test and trace and all these other things to private entities, so that they could build up the privatization of health service. And the same will happen in America. If they do go ahead with the spending on infrastructure, which, you know, don't assume it will happen, because the Congress is still very powerful. There's a lot of right-wing Democrats who might side with the Republicans to stymie this. Not only that, I think the way the disastrous policy that Biden is following will probably see the Republicans regaining Congress in what is 2 years from now. So, you know, whether they will actually successfully really, you know, spend a lot of money on infrastructure is a question. But even if they do, they will spend it on private companies doing the infrastructure, not on the public sector. So neoliberalism continues. And and this is a thing that, again, that I want to go further, because this relates to what Themos was saying, that I think Themos talked about how that the neoliberalism exhausted itself in the 2008-2009 crisis. Well, you could have fooled me. I mean, look at what the neoliberals did. The neoliberals used the 2008 crisis to take over the European Union, which would not been following so much of a neoliberal policy before. But if you read some books on that, there's some excellent books on this, how the neoliberals have taken over the whole constitution, the central bank, the commission. They built neoliberalism directly into the constitution of the European Union. And look at what they did look what austerity was. Austerity was massive further cuts in public spending on working people, cuts in welfare services, more privatization. Look at what's happening around the world. You see all the neoliberal measures being introduced in India. They're just, for the first time, Modi felt confident enough in the last budget to announce that they were going to privatize virtually the whole of everything that's publicly owned in India. Or look at what they're doing with the farmers and so on. And look at what they're doing with the trade unions in India. Look at what they're doing here in Brazil. And if you go around the world, you will see, even at local level, you will see the neoliberals are on the warpath. They are constantly coming up with new ideas to privatize, to cut, whatever, to deregulate. And we are so weak on the left that we're not able to stop them. Why wouldn't they carry on? So I'm sorry, I don't see neoliberalism being on the decline. I see it as they turned that crisis. It should have been a neoliberal crisis in 2008, 2009, but because of the weakness of the left, I remember at the time the BBC saying, asking a question of some left winger saying, why at that time of the crisis, why is it that the people are not on the streets demonstrating against capitalism, calling for socialism? We don't understand. And the neoliberals were able to use their power over the mass media and social media now to turn people against each other and to actually argue for their case even more strongly. And they will do the same. They will do the same, in my opinion, during the 20s. They have learned, and they're very powerful on the question of how do you pose questions. They have learned how to spin everything to their advantage. That doesn't mean to say they're all powerful. They can do everything, and they can always convince the population to follow them. I'm not saying that, but they are past masters at manipulating opinion. So don't think that neoliberalism is on the decline, because I don't think the evidence is there. And we could go into each country and show how they're continuing to use these crises to their advantage. What Jonathan talks about, the rise of the nationalist wing of the capitalists, that's true. But nevertheless, the nationalist wing of the capitalists are neoliberals through and through as well. They don't disagree with the other wing of the capitalists on these questions at all. In fact, they're often more fervent on it. Now, Themos argues that that we are trying to give the idea that we should start on ideology, that we should start from the beginning. If that's what's come across in our document, then that's a mistake we need to look at and rectify, because that's not what we say. We don't say that we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're saying we should learn from the experience of the Soviet Union and from what happened in social democracy in the way that they failed. They implemented public ownership, they implemented planning and so on, but they failed to make it democratic and efficient and innovative. And we need to find out how they did that. And hopefully, when we go into the next section of the manifesto, where we go into detail what our alternative could be, you'll see that there's no way that impression could come, because at the heart of what we're proposing is democratic public planning, democratic public investment, democratic public innovation, democratic public ownership, democratic public services. So I don't think that people reading the manifesto will get that idea. Now, another point, which I think is very important, which I think, and I understand that as Themos said quite correctly, this has only been out for a couple of weeks. Comrades wouldn't have had the chance to read them properly or to think them through, carefully study these documents, fair enough. But we will have the chance to do that. But I think that Themos has got the wrong end of the stick. We're not portraying the neoliberal movement as some idealistic group of individuals. You know, otherwise we would have probably gone into who were all the individuals who turned up, what were the debates they had in that meeting, and so on. Quite the opposite. We say very clearly, and I'll quote you from the document so that you see that we did take this on board. We say very clearly about how this ideology, how it started, and then how it evolved, and we do that in a Marxist way. So, for example, we talk under a headline of evolution of an ideology. We say an ideology only becomes important when it fits in with or appears to further the economic or social interests of class, or at least a significant social group in society. And then we talk about the socialist ideology of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels gained mass support in the 19th and 20th century because it outlined and championed the interests of the growing proletariat and its organization. On the other side of the class struggle, the same is true with the neoliberal ideology. It rapidly came to be seen as the most uncompromising and militant voice for capitalist interests. However, in the process of becoming more powerful or more popular an ideology may evolve into something significantly different from its original conception. And in important ways, this is what has happened to the ideology of neoliberalism. It began as an attempt to halt and reverse the trend towards top-down state-dominated economy and society. And as such, it declared itself for freedom and against dictatorship and against monopolies and corruption. And it was in this guise that neoliberalism initially attracted a key range of economists, philosophers, politicians, etc. But the neoliberal movement soon attracted another element of support, namely right-wing industrialists and employers who saw it as a means of defeating the power of their employees and working people generally, and thereby to increase their share of society's income, which they believed was unjustly siphoned away from them in the post-war settlement, a settlement they had never accepted. These wealthy and powerful interests had the money to greatly advance the cause of the neoliberals. And in the course of so doing, they began to call the tune. Naturally, these big individuals and these big businesses and rich individuals, behind them had no interest in freedom for the masses. And rather than opposing dictatorship, they supported brutal military despots all over the world when it suited their interests. Nor did they care about monopolies or corruption. On the contrary, the striving for monopoly power and the use of corruption to achieve it was their day-to-day means of operation. In time, the ideology of neoliberalism, and even more its practice, favored the interests of the big companies and served the wealthy elites. So far from being the champion of small businesses and open and highly competitive markets, neoliberalism ended up becoming a mouthpiece for big business, defending monopoly and turning a blind eye to large-scale corruption. And then we give lots of examples of this. So we don't have this idea that a small group of individuals got together, came up with these ideas, and they campaigned over, generations to win them. And it was simple like that. We don't believe that. But the thing is, and I should also say that Themos is right. We're not in the period of the 50s and 60s when things happen very slowly. We're in a much more fast and evolving period of, as they used to say in the old CWI, didn't they? Sharp turns and sudden changes. But that's a true characterization of the period we're in. So obviously, there's no need for the left to take decades and decades to gain support. But the point, the model of the neoliberals that I take from there is that they seriously set about developing an ideology or an alternative, whatever you want to call it, and practical policies to put it into practice. So that when neoliberals got into government, they didn't just have a few slogans. They actually had a whole raft of measures and people who worked out these measures to put them into practice. Measures that we didn't often we didn't even understand. Lifting the exchange rates, exchange controls, things like that. We didn't at the time really understand the significance of these things. And so the neoliberals went out and campaigned for their ideas within their class and within the general public. And they came up with all sorts of things which they, before the capitalists were very defensive. If you look before the neoliberals, we were on the offensive. and this is why I don't understand why Themos is against this kind of the importance of ideology, the importance of ideas. That was what Marx and Engels were all about. I mean, if they hadn't come forward with their ideas and their analysis, we would be so much the worse for it. Yeah, other people might have come forward with them later. Yeah, that's not in question. But the fact that they did come forward with those ideas and that people organized around those ideas was absolutely fundamental to the development of our movement. And the result of it was that the capitalists were more and more on the defensive. And the socialist movement in the earlier days, if you go back 100, 120 years or so, the socialists were very confident. They had an idea in their mind that capitalism was chaotic. It was full of crisis. It meant war, it meant exploitation, and that socialism will bring that to an end. We were bringing planning, we were bringing public ownership, we were bringing public services, welfare states, full employment, end exploitation of labor, a whole raft of ideas that people, all the socialist movement held to, even if they were on the right of social democracy, they actually held to a lot of those ideas. And that was meant that we were a very confident movement. We were moving forward, the capitalists were on the defensive. And when the crisis came in 1929, we were coming to the fore in our ideology and capitalism was collapsing. Now, what the boot is on the other foot. The capitalists and their ideologies are making the moves. When you see when the neoliberals come on the television, they're not apologizing for capitalism the way that they used to do in the past. They're aggressive. They've worked out all their ideas. They come up with things like, you attack them on inequality. They say, there's nothing wrong with inequality. Inequality is good. The market is rewarding the winners. They say the same about monopolies, by the way. They have all kind of arguments. I mean, I watch it on British television. Anybody who watches Question Time on British television, which is every week a program, you will see the neoliberal people on the panel, sometimes even the audience, come out very confidently and positively with their ideas. And the left people can't answer them. They've got no answers to give. And that's what I mean about the death of an ideology, when the left can't answer the questions of the neoliberals. And for instance, in Brazil, when they came out with making the central bank independent a few weeks ago, there was no comment from the left. They didn't understand the significance of it. what it means to, you're releasing controls, and the government's releasing controls on its financial controls on the economy and handing them over to the neoliberal financial sector. And there should have been big demonstrations and big fights about that. And it's the same about one thing after another. The left is really in a crisis and don't see. And I've talked about this recently on some different forums I've got into. And I thought this might be controversial, but no. I found that every single person who commented on what I've said about this has come in and agreed with me from all shades of the left. And I think there's an understanding on the left that we are in an ideological crisis, that we don't have, and we have to be serious about this, so that we have to have rethink about how we not just what's in our program, but also how we present it. That's another whole story. So those are the main points I want to. One thing, obviously, I definitely agree with Themos on is, although I think we'll have very different interpretations, is he says we need to review what went wrong in Greece with Syriza and UK with Corbyn. And in fact, what I'm going to do in the summer, when comrades are discussing this draft manifesto, I'm going to actually write up a review of what happened from my perspective and my knowledge of what happened in Britain and where it went wrong. And I have to say, the lack of a democratic socialist ideology was absolutely central to what went wrong with Corbyn. And what went wrong, not just with Corbyn, but with all the forces on the left and why they behaved the way they did. The same problem in Greece, but that's another big debate. Now, I don't, the last point that Themos made is, I think will be covered when we go into the next section of the manifesto. He says that we're looking at the democratic socialist program in a voluntarist way, that we will hand it down to working class people and they will accept it or not. Quite the opposite. That's precisely what's wrong with the left, this top-down approach. And that's what we've got to challenge. I've always argued that we have to get the workers together in each sector by sector, that the trade unions, all the relevant people who are affected, farmers, organizations, whatever it might be, have to get together. They have to work out the program. But we can put forward ideas for that. We can put forward directions of travel, some principles, some outlines. We can't come out with a blueprint. That has to be developed by the working class in each country, because each country is a different level of struggle. Each country has got a different level of resources, different possibilities. So you can't come out with an overall blueprint, even if you wanted to. I'm not saying that you should do. And it's got to be done by working class organizations. Otherwise, how is it going to get mass support? How is it going to be seen as a popular program if it's just by a small group of comrades? So that's my points on what the comrades have said. Roy, I know Roy said about we should, and I'll have a look at this this program to see what we could gain out of that, and also what Jonas said. I think he generally agrees that we need, we need a coherent alternative, because the problem is, in the old days, I remember when I got involved in the movement in the early 70s, and I was one of those. I was willing to go along with a few slogans, go on demonstrations, and I had confidence. And part of that, of course, we already had Soviet Union was in place in Eastern Bloc. We had social democracy was very powerful. We had public ownership and all the rest of it. So it looked like we could adjust things in what we already had. We could reform those things, and then we could, we could create what we wanted. And the slogans that the comrades came up with were good. We used to go on the demonstrations and so on. But we're in a totally different situation now. All those examples that we had have collapsed, and collapsed in disgrace. I mean, even the explanation for their collapse, because we didn't do the work we should have done as a movement to examine properly what went wrong with the Soviet Union, what was wrong with the system, what was wrong with social democracy. We've allowed, because we haven't done that, we've allowed the neoliberals to set the agenda. So it's their explanation of why these things collapse that is in the minds of most people in the world. If they do think about these things, or they don't think about it, they accept the neoliberal interpretation, not our alternative. So that just shows you how it is. And among the mass of people, when you talk to people, most people in the world now are discontented with capitalism. But they're not struggling. Most places are not struggling. Why? Because they don't see an alternative. They don't see, if you mention socialism, and then they don't know what you mean by socialism, Or if they know what you mean, because they're from the older generations, they can easily be put off, you know, because they think it means dictatorship, they think it means inefficiency, bureaucracy, whatever the things that come to their mind. And that is a terrible situation for us on the left to be in. And we have to come, if we do not come forward with a new alternative, not just a few slogans or a few, but something seriously concrete, practical alternative, how we can effectively make the transition to socialism, and things that people can question us on, we can answer those questions. How do we expect anybody to take us seriously? I wouldn't take us seriously. I give the example of it's like an architectural company that's built has had two big prestige projects. Those two projects have collapsed. What do you think the future customers of that company are going to be? Nobody's going to have any confidence, and particularly they didn't even bother. That company didn't even bother to investigate why the collapses happened. At least in capitalism, when a bridge collapses, they do an investigation into why it collapses. And they try to learn some valuable lessons, how to build the bridges in the future and how to check they're still in good shape. I mean, that's how pathetic we are on the left, that we haven't even bothered to do this proper investigation of what went wrong. So how could we possibly come up with anything better that we could restore the trust that people have lost in us? That we can start to regain our credibility. And that's, to me, that is the depth of the problem we're in. And unless we face up to that, we can't just go on by thinking we can use the old programs, the old things, and just tweak them a bit, fine tune them, and somehow it'll do the job. It won't do the job. That's the problem. We have to face up to how bad the situation is on the left. And from that, that's to be fair to neoliberals, they did do that. They openly accepted that their ideology had failed, that the laissez-faire ideology had failed in the Great Economic Depression, and that they needed to come up with a serious effort to develop a new ideology, a new program. And that's what they went and did. So that's the thing I think we have to do. And no, it doesn't need to take us generations to achieve, but we've got to do this kind of work. Otherwise, what the hell are we here for? I mean, how do we expect to win back the support of people after what's happened? That's how I see it.
Thanks. Anybody wants to respond? Timos, Jonathan, anybody else?
How long is the meeting going on for?
Only another 10 minutes. So.
I can say a few words if you want. Yeah. I don't know, it seems a bit strange now. It's like Pat has summed up. And it's like, I would be like reopening the discussion if I made some comments now.
Go ahead, Jonathan. It will be good for us, for our text. Okay. Go for it.
Well, firstly, on the question of ideology, I think the problem is that it's certainly true that in the labor movement, the words ideology, socialist ideology have been used for a long time. I think they're pointing precisely in the direction we don't want to go in, which is ideology is a question of values. It's a question of storytelling. We are the people who will look after the people with the greatest difficulties in society. We're the people that want equality. All those things are fine. I mean, yes, but we have nothing to contribute on that front. And ideology in that sense is a kind of storytelling. And each epoch is defined by one ideology being hegemonic over another. Of course, there are always policies connected to those ideologies. And some of the policies of neoliberalism continue, but the storytelling, the actual core of its ideology is gone. Nobody, one should never say nobody, these circumstances, but the grip which neoliberal ideology had on society, which provided a social basis for supporting the policies which were taken, that grip no longer exists. Yes, they can continue and they push for their policies here and there and the rest of it, but it is no longer, since 2008, it is no longer the hegemonic ideology of the capitalists. It's not their means of building a popular base. Policies were always something separate from the actual ideology of neoliberalism. And that's why I think Marx's use of the word ideology is actually much more useful, because that's in the sense in which he uses it, rather than in the kind of popular way, which is, what are your values? Well, we should be nice to each other. You know, that's fine. But for us, it's a question of analyzing and putting forward an alternative mode of production. That's what's missing since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a mode of production. And then one could say, well, and it was certainly not a capitalist mode of production. One could say, well, we want like a Soviet mode of production, but we want it with our values, our ideology, more equality, more democracy, and all the rest of it. But the problem for the left is fundamentally that the alternative mode of production no longer exists. There is no such thing as a socialist mode of production today. It hasn't been touched on in anything which has been said either today or anything which has been written so far. And that's the key thing which we have to solve. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. I'll leave it at that, because I'll just say one thing about the question of program. That's not a question of program. I think programmatic points, I agree with Themos, they're worked out in the struggle together with people. And I mean, in the Labour Party, we worked out programmatic points to struggle on, like open selection. We got pretty close to actually achieving that. And that could have actually set things off on a different trajectory than the Labour Party actually did, but we failed in the last instance there. Yes, those kind of things have to be worked out in the movement. But the mode of production is a systemic, needs a systemic analysis, an in-depth look at how things fit together in order to produce things in a rational way based upon the class balance of forces which exist in society. That is not something which you're going to work out in the midst of the struggle. And that's what's lacking since the Soviet Union was not a great mode of production. That's why it collapsed in the end. But in the place of that mode of production, we have nothing. And that's the problem which we're confronted with.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. Time is more or less up. Anybody wants a closing remark? Yeah, Timus?
Well, I was going to say a few things about ideology and neoliberalism, but I quite agree with Jonathan on that, so I'm not going to touch it again. As for the need for discussing the mode of production, yes, we should discuss the mode of production. But this is quite different from what Pat describes. It's quite different from the from giving the nuts and bolts of and the details of the new society, and this is what we should be careful about. And it's also I cannot understand why we should see the neoliberals story as a good story to copy, because I mean, Hayek and the rest of them, they would see today's neoliberalism with abhorrence. And today's neoliberals, they see Hayek and the rest as crackpots that they said a few things, a few random things here and there, and they are picking on them and exploiting them. So we should. I cannot see the point of wasting pages and pages and pages on the neoliberal story and showing them as an example of what we should do. What is the usefulness of that in discussing the manifesto? Anyway, there are a lot of things that we have to discuss in the future. In today's discussion, to me, it shows how we have drifted apart because of lack of discussion and contact in the last years, and this is dangerous. I mean, we cannot understand each other anymore. What I say, Pat doesn't register, and what Pat says, I don't register them. So where are we going? I mean, we have to find a way to understand each other and see what we are saying and address the issues.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Temos. Any response? Any last? Pat?
I think the only question, the only one point I would make is I think that there's some confusion about terminology here as well. Because when I talk about a program, I'm not talking about the thing that Jonathan commented on, you know, the demands you put forward for, you know, increasing wages or whatever it might be in the course of a struggle. I'm talking about the program for the transition to socialism. I just mentioned it. It's funny, you know, this is not original at all. Trotsky, when he in 1938, when Trotsky sent the final draft of the transitional program to the Secretary of the Fourth International for it to be, you know, printed and circulated. I'll reproduce this so comrades might be interested. He sent it in a letter in which he said that they needed 3 documents. So the Fourth International needed 3 documents. One, the transitional program, which was basically an attempt by them to link up the day-to-day events that were happening in capitalism with the need to change society, with the need for an alternative to capitalism. The second document he talked about was a more modern analysis of capitalism. He said, you know, the old analysis of capitalism needed to be updated. But the third document he put forward, which has never been attempted until what I think we're trying to do now, the third document he recommended was that they needed a program for what a revolutionary government would do if it came to power. What kind of things it would need to do to, and you know, and obviously not a blueprint, but a general, the kind of thing we're trying to do. That's the kind of program I'm talking about. If we came to power, not us personally, but working people came to power in any country, what are the kinds of things they need to do, learning from the past? And that's what we're missing, in my opinion. And I think the fact we're missing is criminal, that we're missing this. And it's the lack of that kind of practical program. I'm not talking about the program that includes, you know, what wage increases you get, but how would you, you know, how would you carry out public ownership? How would you carry out planning and all the rest of it? And if we don't, and learning the mistakes of the past and rectifying those with better proposals. And without that, I don't see how we can be credible as a force. Who would intellectually, ordinary people would believe us? Because otherwise we're just we're carrying on as if none of this has happened. And we're going to come forward with, you know, I don't know what we're going to come forward. We're going to come forward with agitational demands. Which we work out in the course of the struggle, as Jonathan put it. But I don't think that that's not what he said. I'm not saying that Jonathan said that. So but the thing is that Jonathan says we need a new mode of production. And what does that mean? I mean, what do we mean by a new mode of production? We haven't discussed that. And for me, a new mode of production is exactly what I'm arguing for. And that's what we have to spell out. And if we don't spell that out, we've got no hope, in my opinion, of winning the intellectual argument, never mind convincing working people. And the question about the original neoliberals, I think I heard Demos say, the original neoliberals would see the liberals today with abhorrence. I don't believe that's true. I mean, the characters who were the founders of the neoliberals, Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on, they lived to very old ages. And they were very proud of their movement and what it had achieved and what it happened to be putting into practice. So I think that they, you know, because they were very flexible, what they were about was putting capitalists back on top, increasing the share of national income going to the capitalists, increasing their profitability, putting power back into the hands of capitalists, weakening the labor movement, weakening the state control of the economy, blah, blah, blah. And this is what they've achieved. Okay, you know, that we know that they've been, you know, maybe some aspects of what they put forward ideologically didn't get carried out or have been distorted. But the main essence of what they were trying to do was to put capitalism back on top and weaken the left and labor movement, the socialist movement. They've achieved it fantastically, unbelievable results. So of course, no wonder they were very proud. They were very proud, you know. And why I think we need to use the lessons of the neoliberals is it just shows you what, even when you're in crisis of your ideology, what you can do. If you seriously set about, you face up to that problem, that your ideology is in crisis, and you seriously set about reversing that situation, developing your ideas, learning from the past. I mean, their conclusions, of course, were horrific, were nightmarish, as Demos says. You know, we're not admiring the output of the neoliberals. What I'm admiring is their fucking tenacity and their determination and their willingness to go on for a long time, even though they looked like they were going against the stream. I think that's something that any of us could be proud of doing. And that's something that we on the left and the revolutionary left have always prided ourselves. Do you remember it's a slogan, you know, like books like Against the Stream? It was produced by the Trotskyists at the end of the 20s and into 30s and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that what the neoliberals did, that in that sense, has lessons for us today, because we are in a hell of a crisis. Unless we face up to that crisis and come forward with something radically improved on what we've done in the past, I don't think we're going to be able to cut it or achieve anything. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. That seems to be a thing that everybody agrees about, just not in agreement about what to call it, what to name it, whether ideology or program or new mode of production.
Yeah.
But when people approach us and say, what is it you want? What will that new system you talk about do for me? Then we should have some answers to that. And I understand that's what's the purpose of the next work you're going to do, to some extent, or at least to focus on that. So that would be interesting. What is there a timing on that, Pat?
Well, we did put a little kind of draft timetable up we circulated that, so you can see that. I think we're planning the next set of papers, which will be linked together. We're hoping to get them out by the middle of April, yeah. And then we're hoping to get because there's 3 sets of papers we need. The one is on, this, what kind of outline program. One is on international questions, which then flow on from that. And the third one is on what are the barriers to gaining support for this manifesto, and kind of issues like that. How would we approach the labor movement, and how could we what are the incorrect courses that could divert us from this, etc., like individual terrorism and some other things like that. So so I'm thinking, so the second one we're aiming for is that one's quite quick, was probably end of April, and the last one by the middle of May, with the idea that we can then in June, we will condense it all down to a much shorter. We'll take on board the comments that people have made, which we will take on board seriously, and we'll, we'll cut it down to say a maximum of 60 pages, and that will be the condensed version we'll put out that the comrades then can discuss in the summer. And what we're suggesting is that we have a conference on this in September. Mm-hmm. Go through the wording of that, and hopefully in the meantime, comrades will have come in with their comments, and have had more time to think about it. Will come in with maybe alternative wordings or whatever they might like, and then we'll go through that in September with the idea of producing the finalized version in October. That's what we're planning anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, thank you to everybody, and we'll carry on the discussion and send out word when there's a new meeting planned. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask one question? Can I just ask one question? Where is the link? Where are you going to publish the link to the recording of that session? Because I wasn't able to participate in, for most part, I wasn't really able to participate. So that would be pretty important for me to actually, get a chance to watch it.
Yeah, we put, as usual, we put the links to the recordings on our internal Facebook page, our public Facebook page, and within WhatsApp. To our Socialist Commons group.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Right.
Bye bye.